Number 1, Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf. She had a 4.0 GPA. She worked a part-time job at Wendy's to save money for college. She wanted to be a criminal defense attorney. And on the night of July 5th, 2012, 16-year-old Skylar Neese finished her shift, came home to her family's apartment in Star City, West Virginia, and told her parents goodnight. Everything about her life pointed forward. What happened next pointed nowhere anyone expected. Skylar Annette Neese was born on February 10, 1996, and grew up in a tight-knit household with her parents, Dave and Mary. By all accounts, she was the kind of teenager parents brag about: responsible, warm, fiercely loyal to the people she loved. She had held her part-time job without missing a single shift. Her teachers praised her. Her bedroom walls were covered with plans for the future. All and at the center of her social world were two girls she had known and trusted for years, Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf. Sheila and Skylar had been friends since they were 8 years old, meeting at a local children's activity program and becoming almost inseparable. When Sheila transferred to University High School in Morgantown, the friendship continued without missing a beat. Rachel Schoaf joined their circle during freshman year, a girl from a devout Catholic family, more reserved than Sheila, but equally close to Skylar. To everyone watching from the outside, these three were a unit, a trio, best friends in every sense of the word. Dave Neese later described Sheila as practically another daughter in his household. She helped with family events. She knew where the spare key was kept. She knew Skylar's habits, her schedule, her trust. But beneath the surface of that friendship, something had quietly shifted. In the months leading up to the summer of 2012, Skylar began posting cryptic messages on social media, vague references to feeling left out, to friends who weren't acting like friends. One post read, "Sick of being at home. Thanks friends. Love hanging out with you all too." Another simply said that she could never completely trust certain people anymore. Those posts would later carry a weight no one recognized at the time. What the public didn't know, what even Skylar may not have fully understood, was that Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf had developed a secret romantic relationship. And according to Rachel's later confession, the two girls had become convinced that Skylar knew. They feared she would tell people. And rather than simply ending the friendship, the two teenagers made a decision that prosecutors would later describe as calculated, deliberate, and premeditated. They planned to kill her. In the early hours of July 6, 2012, Skylar climbed out of her bedroom window using a hidden stool she kept in her closet. Surveillance footage from outside her apartment complex captured her at 12:30 in the morning, walking to a waiting car and getting in without hesitation. She believed she was going for a late drive with her two best friends, just as they had done dozens of times before. She left without her phone charger, without her contact lens case, without any sign she thought she wouldn't be back. Her window was left slightly open. She was never seen alive again. Sheila and Rachel drove Skylar roughly 30 miles across the state line into Wayne Township, Greene County, Pennsylvania. As they pulled into a wooded area they had visited before, a place the three of them had gone together in the past to hang out. When they got out of the car, Schoaf later told investigators the plan was already in motion. At the count of 3, they turned on Skylar and attacked her from behind. Skylar fought back. She fought hard, but she was outnumbered and she was betrayed. Investigators would later determine she suffered more than 50 wounds across her neck, back, torso, and both hands. Injuries consistent with someone fighting desperately to survive. The two girls attempted to bury her, but the ground was too hard. They covered her with branches, leaves, and dirt. Then they drove home, changed clothes, and went back to their lives. The next morning, Dave Neese found his daughter's bed empty, her screen removed, and a stool hidden in her closet. He called police. That same day, Sheila Eddy called the Neese family to express concern, telling them she had no idea where Skylar was. Over the following weeks, she posted on social media alongside Skylar's parents, shared missing person flyers, and performed every gesture of a worried friend. Rachel Schoaf did the same. Both girls were interviewed by police early in the investigation and gave matching stories. They had driven around, smoked marijuana, and dropped Skylar off near her home. But the stories didn't hold up for long. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage from a nearby convenience store and pulled cell phone records. The data placed both girls in Blacksville, West Virginia, miles from where Skylar was supposedly dropped off, at 4 in the morning. When police retraced the described route with Sheila, she said the car had turned left at a key intersection. Rachel had said right, small cracks, but telling ones. By the fall of 2012, the FBI and West Virginia State Police had officially joined the investigation, and detectives were circling. Then, on December 28, 2012, Rachel Shoaf's mother called 911. In the background of the recording, Rachel can be heard screaming. She was admitted to a psychiatric hospital and remained there for 5 days. When she was released, she asked to be taken directly to her attorney's office. And on January 3, 2013, she confessed everything. She told investigators the plan had been Sheila's idea. She described the drive, the location, and the attack in detail. She also told police about her and Sheila's secret relationship, all and the fear that Skylar would expose them. Shoaf then offered to do something extraordinary. She agreed to wear a wire in an attempt to get Sheila to incriminate herself. The effort failed. Sheila never said what investigators needed to hear, but Rachel's confession led police to another breakthrough, a forensic examination of Sheila Eddy's car. Inside the trunk, laboratory analysts confirmed the presence of Skylar Neese's DNA. On January 16, 2013, 6 months after her disappearance, Skylar's remains were discovered in a wooded area in Pennsylvania. Found exactly where Rachel said they would be, after the winter snow had finally melted. On May 1, 2013, Rachel Shoaf formally pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, cooperating fully with prosecutors. On September 6, 2013, Sheila Eddy was indicted on charges of first-degree murder, a kidnapping and conspiracy to commit murder. She pleaded not guilty until January 28, 2014, the morning her trial was set to begin. Facing the prospect of additional charges from Pennsylvania authorities, Sheila changed her plea. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. She expressed no remorse in court, not one word. Rachel Shoaf was sentenced to 30 years, with parole eligibility after 10. She apologized publicly to Skylar's parents. Dave Neese later said he didn't believe it. Today, both women are housed at Lakin Correctional Center, a maximum security prison in West Columbia, West Virginia. Records show they are, in fact, incarcerated in the same facility. Rachel has been denied parole twice, in 2023 and again in 2024. Sheila becomes eligible for her first parole hearing in 2028. Anise Skylar's parents have attended every hearing and have vowed to continue doing so. The case also changed West Virginia law. The disappearance directly led to the passage of what became known informally as Skylar's Law, which reformed the state's Amber Alert system to speed up the response to missing child reports. Skylar Neese wanted to be a defense attorney. She never got the chance. But her name is now written into the legal code of the state she grew up in, which means, in a way, the law she always believed in is still carrying her forward. And while 2 teenage girls plotted their way into infamy behind a web of lies and a trusted friendship, then the next case on our list involves someone who used an entirely different kind of trust, the kind patients place in the hands of a caregiver, to become one of the most quietly devastating killers this state has ever seen. Number 2, Reta Mays. She won the Nursing Assistant of the Year award. Let that sink in for a moment. The woman who would later be described by a federal judge as the worst kind of monster, the kind nobody sees coming, was once publicly recognized by the very hospital where she carried out her crimes as one of its most outstanding caregivers. That detail alone tells you everything you need to know about how Reta Mays managed to do what she did for as long as she did, without a single person stopping her. Reta Phyllis Mays was born on June 16, 1975, in Reynoldsville, West Virginia. By most accounts, then her early life was unremarkable. She grew up in the Mountain State, eventually enlisting in the United States Army West Virginia National Guard. She deployed overseas, serving with the 1092nd Engineer Battalion in Iraq and Kuwait. 2 separate tours, one from 2000 to 2001 and another from 2003 to 2004. When she returned home, she pursued what looked like a natural second career in public service. For several years, between 2005 and 2012, she worked as a corrections officer at the North Central Regional Jail in Greenwood, West Virginia. She left that position amid an internal investigation. Records indicate she had been accused of being excessively harsh with inmates, but that cloud apparently didn't follow her far enough. In June 2015, Reta Mays began working as a nursing assistant at the Louis A. Johnson Veterans Medical Center in Clarksburg, West Virginia. There was one significant problem that nobody appeared to catch at the time. She had no certification, no license. She was not qualified to administer medication to patients under any circumstances. And yet she was hired, assigned to overnight shifts on Ward 3A, the medical surgical unit, and given regular, largely unsupervised access to some of the most vulnerable patients in the building. Elderly military veterans in their 80s and 90s, men who had served their country across conflicts from World War II to Korea to Vietnam, now quietly living out their final years in the care of a facility built to honor them. In July 2017, something began to go wrong on Ward 3A. Patients started experiencing sudden, severe drops in blood sugar, a condition known as hypoglycemia. The episodes were alarming not just because of their severity, but because of who they were happening to. Many of the men experiencing these crashes had no history of diabetes. They weren't insulin dependent. There was no medical reason for their blood sugar to be collapsing in the middle of the night, and yet it kept happening repeatedly, and the men kept dying. Robert Edge Sr., William Holloway, who was 96 years old, George Nelson Shaw Sr., aged 81, Archie Edgell, an 84-year-old Korean War veteran whose blood sugar dropped to 24, a reading so dangerously low it should have been medically impossible without outside intervention. Felix McDermott, Raymond Golden, 88, Robert Lee Kozul, 89, and Russell R. Posey Sr., a 92-year-old Navy veteran who died 2 weeks after suffering an unexplained hypoglycemic event. 4 of these deaths occurred within a 16-day window, and through it all, one name appeared consistently on the ward logs, always present, always nearby when the crashes occurred: nursing assistant Reta Mays. Investigators would later learn that Mays had been taking insulin from the hospital's medication supply, medication that, as a nursing assistant, she had absolutely no authorization to access or administer, and injecting it into patients while she was alone with them. The insulin caused rapid catastrophic drops in blood sugar. Most of the men never recovered. In her own words, recorded after her eventual guilty plea, Mays stated that she had administered the insulin to patients she believed were suffering so they could pass away. In her description, gently. She also acknowledged that her actions gave her a sense of control during a period when her personal and professional life had fallen apart. Her husband, Gordon Mays, was incarcerated at the time on child pornography charges. In phone calls to him from the hospital, Mays was recorded complaining about having to sit with a patient she wanted to, in her own words, freaking strangle. That call was made the morning after one of the blood sugar episodes, but investigators didn't have any of this yet when the hospital's internal review first began in 2018. The formal investigation opened in June 2018 and was jointly led by the VA's Office of Inspector General and the FBI's Pittsburgh Field Office. Over the following 2 years, agents conducted more than 300 interviews, reviewed thousands of pages of medical records, and consulted with forensic experts and endocrinologists across the country. One of the most difficult steps in the process was asking families for something almost unbearably painful: permission to exhume their loved ones so that proper autopsies could be performed. Several of the veterans had already been buried with full military honors. Their families agreed anyway because they wanted answers. Mays was interviewed 3 separate times during the investigation. Each time, she denied any involvement. The second interview, conducted by a specialist agent from the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, lasted 5 hours. By that point, investigators had built a case around her. They had the glucometer logs, which showed that Mays had taken a disproportionate number of severely low blood sugar readings compared to any other staff member. They had her sitter logs, which placed her one-on-one with victims just before their deaths. They had her internet search history, searches for female serial killers conducted on her personal devices. And they had records showing she had been watching a Netflix series called Nurses Who Kill, including an episode specifically focused on insulin-based murders. Even so, Mays was not arrested immediately. Investigators needed the forensic evidence from the autopsies to be bulletproof. Special Agent Keith Vereb from the VA, Inspector General's office, later explained the standard they were holding themselves to. Not just proving insulin was present, but ruling out every other possible cause of death for each individual patient, building an airtight case for every single victim, one by one. On July 14, 2020, Reta Mays was taken into custody. She appeared in federal court in Clarksburg and entered a guilty plea to 7 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of assault with intent to commit murder, the latter in connection with Russell Posey, who did not die immediately but passed away roughly 2 weeks after the injection. She wept openly in court. Prosecutors noted that approximately 20 suspicious deaths had occurred during her time on Ward 3A. Charges were brought only in the cases where the evidence was considered sufficient beyond doubt. Sentencing took place on May 11, 2021, in the United States District Court for the Northern District of West Virginia. More than 30 family members of victims filled the courtroom. Hundreds more watched via Zoom. And now one family member asked Mays directly, "What gave you the right to decide to take him from his loved ones?" Mays, in tears, gave a brief statement. "There's no words I can say that can offer the families any comfort. I can only say, I'm sorry for the pain I caused them and my family." Her defense attorneys argued she had suffered from PTSD and military sexual trauma during her service, and requested a sentence of 30 years. The prosecution asked for the maximum. U.S. District Judge Thomas Klee addressed Mays before delivering his ruling, directly and without ambiguity. "Several times, your counsel made the point that you shouldn't be considered a monster," he said. "Respectfully, I disagree with that. You are the worst kind. Iggy, you're the monster that no one sees coming." He sentenced Reta Mays to 7 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each murder, plus an additional 20 years for the attempted murder charge. She is ineligible for parole. She was also ordered to pay over $172,000 in restitution to the victims' families, the VA hospital, Medicare, and insurance companies. In July 2021, she was transferred to a low-security federal correctional institution in Aliceville, Alabama. The VA's Inspector General later published a damning report describing the hospital's failures as serious, pervasive, and deep-rooted. Failures that allowed Mays to operate undetected for nearly a full year. The men who died in that hospital had survived wars. They had come home. They had grown old. And they had trusted a system built specifically to care for them. That trust was shattered from the inside by someone carrying an award with their name on it. And while Reta Mays hid in plain sight behind a uniform and a title, the next case on our list involves a woman whose crime was hiding in plain sight behind something far more ordinary. The simple, devastating silence of a 2-year coma. Number 3, Jean Whitefeather and Donald Lance. The neighbor almost didn't make the call. They had watched for months, children standing in lines in the yard, performing chores in all weather, never playing, never laughing, never doing what children do. A teenage girl and her younger brother, increasingly absent from view. A shed on the property that seemed to have people inside it. Something about all of it felt deeply wrong. Yes, but calling the police on your neighbors is not a decision most people make lightly. On the morning of October 2nd, 2023, someone in Sissonville, West Virginia, finally picked up the phone. What deputies found when they arrived would shock an entire state, and eventually, the entire country. Jean K. Whitefeather, 63, and Donald Ray Lance, 62, appeared on paper to be something admirable. A couple who had opened their home and their family to children who needed one. They had adopted 5 siblings, all black, while living in Minnesota. The children, ranging in age from 5 to 16, had come from a difficult biological background. And records show the couple had at various points sought help from child welfare agencies for behavioral issues, particularly involving the oldest boy, who had been diagnosed with multiple mental health conditions. From the outside, this was a family navigating something genuinely hard. 2 white parents, 5 black children with complex histories, working through challenges together. That was the story Whitefeather and Lance told. The evidence told something else entirely. In 2018, the family relocated from Minnesota to a farm in Washington state. It was there, according to forensic data later recovered from Whitefeather's cell phone, that the abuse began to take shape. Text messages retrieved by investigators dated as far back as 2021 showed Whitefeather referring to the children using racial slurs, calling them dirty, and expressing that she wished for a life without them. Murr's videos recovered from the same device showed Donald Lance raising a PVC pipe toward the oldest boy in a threatening posture. In another clip, Lance can be seen berating the children while striking a table with a stick, yelling and cursing as the children stood in fear. Whitefeather, in the background of some recordings, can be heard laughing. The family's youngest child, the only one who would not ultimately be named as a victim in the criminal case, later wrote in a court letter that she had been taught to laugh at her siblings and told they were bad. In May 2023, the family moved again, this time to Sissonville, West Virginia, a quiet community outside Charleston. 5 months later, neighbors were watching. When Kanawha County Sheriff's deputies responded to the welfare call on October 2nd, 2023, they knocked on the shed door and heard a voice from inside. A 16-year-old girl responded that she and her 14-year-old brother had no way to get out. Deputies attempted to locate a key for several minutes. There was none accessible. They used a crowbar to force the door open. The officer who testified later at trial described being immediately hit by a wall of heat and body odor the moment the door gave way. Inside, a broken, non-functioning air conditioning unit, a single sleeping bag, a camping toilet, a cooler with stale food remnants. The two teenagers had been living in this space, sleeping on concrete, using a plastic cup as a bathroom. Mirror surveillance footage from cameras. Whitefeather and Lance had installed themselves, reportedly to monitor the children, showed the teens had been confined to the shed for approximately 2 months before police arrived. Inside the main residence, a 9-year-old girl was found alone and crying in an unsecured upstairs loft with no barrier to prevent a fall. A 4th child was located with Lance when he eventually returned to the property. All 5 children were found malnourished, unwashed, and wearing dirty clothing. The eldest boy was barefoot, with visible open sores on his feet. Whitefeather and Lance were arrested on the scene. Investigators confiscated Whitefeather's cell phone and submitted it to the West Virginia Fusion Center for forensic analysis. What came back was staggering. Approximately 1.3 million pieces of data, including hundreds of hours of text messages and video files documenting the abuse across both Washington and West Virginia, spanning at least 2 years. Trial began in January 2025 in Kanawha County Circuit Court before Judge Mary Claire Akers and lasted 11 days. The jury heard from 16 witnesses, including 3 of the children themselves. The eldest daughter, now an adult, took the stand and described years of deprivation, forced outdoor labor with no tools, being denied food except for peanut butter sandwiches delivered at scheduled intervals, being sprayed with bear spray, and being called racial slurs consistently by Whitefeather. She testified that when police finally arrived that October morning, she was initially afraid to speak because she feared making Whitefeather angry. That prosecutors displayed the couple's own surveillance footage, recorded by cameras they had installed themselves, showing children being forced to stand with their hands on their heads for hours at a time, kept in the shed under watch, and denied basic necessities. Assistant Prosecutor Madison Tuck told the jury plainly, these children were not brought here to be raised. They were brought here to serve another purpose entirely. The defense argued the couple was overwhelmed, that the oldest boy's behavioral issues were severe and dangerous, and that West Virginia's child welfare system had failed to provide adequate support. Lance's attorney contended the shed arrangement was a safety measure, not a punishment. Whitefeather's attorney described the situation as poor parenting decisions, not criminal ones. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning its verdict on the January 29, 2025, guilty on 31 of 35 combined charges. Whitefeather was convicted of human trafficking, forced labor, child abuse, and neglect, and 4 counts of civil rights violations based on the race of the children. Lance was convicted on forced labor, human trafficking, and child abuse charges. Sentencing took place on March 19, 2025. The children addressed the court. One wrote, "I will be something amazing. I will be strong and beautiful. You will always be exactly what you are, horrible." The eldest daughter asked the judge to make Whitefeather and Lance stand with their hands on their heads throughout the entire proceeding, the same position they had forced the children to hold for hours at a time. And Judge Akers acknowledged the request and said she understood precisely why it was made. But she could not grant it because doing so, she noted with heavy irony, would itself constitute cruel and unusual punishment under the law. Then she handed down her sentence. Addressing the couple directly, Judge Akers said, "You came here because you thought that the people of West Virginia would turn a blind eye to what you were doing. You brought these children to West Virginia, a place I know is almost heaven, and you put them in hell. This court will now put you in yours. May God have mercy on your souls, because this court will not." Gene Whitefeather was sentenced to a maximum of 215 years in prison. Donald Lance received a maximum of 160 years. Both sentences are to be served consecutively. They are also required to pay $280,000 each in restitution. Multiple civil lawsuits have since been filed on behalf of all 5 children. As of 2025, the youngest child, the one who is kept separate, who watched everything happen, wrote in her letter to the court that she can now ride a bike, she can run, she is learning to count and to talk better. She said she was hurt too, and she said that kids should not be picked on by their parents, they should be loved. And while that case was defined by years of hidden cruelty finally dragged into the light, the next story on our list begins not with a long secret, but with a single, devastating moment. A woman left for dead in her own home who spent 2 years in silence before the truth finally spoke for her. Number 4, Wanda Palmer. For 2 years, and it's the only witness to what happened inside that trailer, couldn't speak a single word. On the morning of June 10th, 2020, lawn care workers arrived at a property on Flatwoods Road near Cottageville, West Virginia, a quiet rural community in Jackson County, roughly 45 miles north of Charleston. It was an ordinary Wednesday. They were there to mow the grass. What they found when they approached the trailer stopped them cold. They ran up the hill to a neighboring home and told the family what they had seen. An emergency call went out. Deputies responded within minutes. Inside, they found Wanda Palmer, 51 years old, slumped in an upright position on her couch. She was covered in blood. Her head had sustained what the Jackson County Sheriff would later describe as massive amounts of trauma, injuries consistent with a hatchet or machete-style weapon. She was not conscious. She was barely breathing. The deputies who first entered that trailer were convinced they were looking at a deceased person. It was only when someone moved closer and noticed the faint, shallow rise and fall of her chest that they realized Wanda Palmer was still alive. Jackson County Sheriff Ross Mellinger later said, plainly and without hesitation, "I wouldn't have wagered a nickel for her life that morning. She was circling the drain medically." Emergency responders transported her immediately. She was in critical condition. The weapon was never found at the scene. And just like that, the investigation hit a wall that would stand completely immovable for 2 full years. Wanda Palmer had grown up in the area. She was known to neighbors and local authorities. Her mother, Eileen, lived next door, close enough that on the night of the attack, she had her windows open. She heard nothing, not a sound. The silence of it was one of the first things that struck investigators as deeply unsettling. A violent attack of that severity, in a trailer that size, with her mother next door and her windows open, and nobody heard anything at all. Detectives began working through the limited evidence available. There were no security cameras, no cell phone records linking anyone to the scene, no witnesses to the attack itself. What they did have was one statement from a single witness in the area who reported seeing Wanda's brother, Daniel Palmer III, on her porch around midnight on the night before she was discovered. Daniel was 55 years old, as he and Wanda had a documented history of conflict between them. Court records described it as a violent history. When detectives brought Daniel in and questioned him, he denied everything. He said he had not been to his sister's home in the days leading up to the attack. He denied any knowledge of what had happened to her. Without a weapon, without surveillance footage, without cell phone data, and without any eyewitness to the attack itself, investigators had nowhere to go. Daniel Palmer remained a person of interest, a suspect in the minds of the people working the case. But interest and evidence are 2 different things entirely. The case stalled. Wanda was transferred to a long-term care facility in New Martinsville, West Virginia, where she remained unresponsive as weeks turned to months and months turned to a year, and then beyond. For 2 years, the investigation had exactly one potential break waiting for it, and that break was Wanda herself. If she ever woke up, she was the only one who knew what had happened inside that trailer. In late June 2022, an adult protective services worker assigned to Wanda's case contacted the Jackson County Sheriff's Department with unexpected news. Wanda was beginning to emerge from the coma. She was able to respond to basic prompts. She was waking up. On July 12, 2022, more than 2 years after the attack, a deputy traveled to the care facility in New Martinsville and entered Wanda Palmer's room alone. According to the criminal complaint that would follow, Wanda appeared oriented to her situation. She was giving coherent answers. She was limited. She could not yet hold full conversations. And her responses came slowly. But she was present, she was aware, and she understood what was being asked of her. The deputy asked her about the attack. Wanda indicated she remembered being hurt inside her trailer. The deputy then asked who had wounded her. Wanda said her brother. When the deputy asked why Daniel had attacked her, Wanda Palmer gave an answer so simple, it landed like a stone in still water. She said he was mean. She then asked for prayer. That was enough. Within days, an arrest warrant was obtained. On July 15, 2022, deputies located Daniel Palmer III and took him into custody. According to reports, and it took several hours for investigators to get him calm enough to be processed. He was so combative that the magistrate had to physically travel from the courthouse to the sheriff's office to conduct the arraignment on site. Daniel Palmer was charged with attempted murder and malicious wounding. His bond was set at $500,000. Sheriff Mellinger, speaking to reporters after the arrest, described the breakthrough with a sense of something close to awe. From an investigator's standpoint, this is about as rare as it gets, he said. The keys to the whole thing lay with the victim herself. And with her unable to communicate, we were left with nothing. Now, lo and behold, 2 years later, boom, she's awake and able to tell us exactly what happened. He added that it was, in his view, a testament to the perseverance and the strength of Wanda herself. But the story did not end in a courtroom. Days after his arrest, Daniel Palmer III fell seriously ill. He had reportedly been in poor health at the time of his arrest. And shortly after being taken into custody, he was hospitalized. Daniel Palmer died in custody in late July 2022, just weeks after being charged. He never stood trial. He never faced a jury. He never answered under oath for what happened in that trailer. The case was closed without a conviction. No trial, no verdict, no sentence. The man Wanda Palmer named as the person who left her for dead simply died before the legal process could reach him. The weapon was never recovered. The full account of what happened on the night of June 9, 2020, may exist only in the memory of one woman, a woman who spent 2 years in silence and then, against every medical expectation, came back to tell it. Wanda Palmer survived something most people do not. And while her story ended not with justice in a courtroom, but with the strange, unresolved quiet of a case that will never be tried, the next case on our list shows what happens when calculated violence is turned not on one person, but on 4, all in a single devastating day. Number 5, Samantha Burns. She called her mother at 9:46 in the evening on November 11, 2002, to say she was going to stay at a friend's house that night. Her voice was calm. There was nothing in it that suggested anything was wrong. It was the last time anyone who loved her would hear from her. Samantha Burns was 19 years old, and she was never seen again. Samantha Nicole Burns grew up in West Hamlin, a small community in Lincoln County, West Virginia. She was the kind of young woman her family described with quiet pride, responsible, warm, and working steadily towards something better. By November 2002, she was enrolled at Marshall University Community and Technical College in Huntington, and she was supporting herself with a part-time job at the J.C. Penney store inside the Barboursville Mall. She also sold candy boxes as part of a school fundraiser, keeping a supply of them in the back of her burgundy 1999 Chevrolet Cavalier, a detail that would later become a crucial thread in the investigation. On the evening of November 11th, she met her aunt at the mall to buy clothing for one of her nieces. They arrived separately and parked in different areas of the lot. At some point after the visit, Samantha made her phone call home. Then she walked back through that parking lot toward her car. And somewhere in the dark and the ordinary noise of a Tuesday night, 2 men who had escaped from a Kentucky jail a week earlier were watching. Chadrick Evan Folks and Brandon Leon Basham had been cellmates at the Hopkins County Detention Center in Madisonville, Kentucky. On November 4th, 2002, they escaped together by scaling a wall in the recreation yard using a makeshift rope constructed from blankets and sheets. Security cameras were not in their normal positions that day. The two men were unsupervised in the yard for roughly 90 minutes before anyone noticed they were gone. By the time an alarm was raised, Folks and Basham were already on foot and moving. And what followed was a 17-day multi-state crime spree that cut through Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, West Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. In the days after their escape, the pair carjacked a man at knife point in Kentucky, tying him to a tree before stealing his vehicle. They stole firearms in Indiana. They committed robberies and burglaries across Ohio. They were moving constantly, fueled by methamphetamine, erratic and increasingly dangerous. By November 10th, they had made their way to Canova, West Virginia, near Huntington, where they checked into a motel under false pretenses, wearing camouflage clothing they had recently purchased. On the night of November 11th, according to statements Folks later made to the FBI, the two men drove to the Barboursville Mall, intending to break into cars and steal purses. As they split up in the parking lot. The next time Folks saw Basham, he was driving a car slowly up and down the rows of the lot, calling Folks' name. In the passenger seat was a 19-year-old woman. What happened to Samantha Burns in the hours that followed has never been fully, publicly established in open court. What investigators pieced together from evidence, confessions, and statements is this. The men used Burns' ATM card at two separate local banks on the evening of November 11th. In the early hours of November 12th, emergency responders were called to a rural road near Lavallette, West Virginia, where a car was found burning at the edge of a cemetery. The vehicle was later identified as Samantha's Burgundy Cavalier. Folks and Basham returned to their motel that morning, carrying muddy clothing. As Basham told the others with them that they had stolen some money. Within days, those traveling with the men noticed something around Basham's neck, a heart-shaped ring on a chain. He told them he had stolen it from a car. It was later identified as belonging to Samantha Burns. A massive search began in West Virginia. Law enforcement and volunteers combed the area around the burned vehicle. Samantha's disappearance drew immediate regional attention. A 19-year-old college student, last seen at a busy mall, her car found burned at a cemetery 3 miles outside of Huntington. Within days, investigators had identified Folks and Basham as suspects through a combination of ATM records, witness accounts, and evidence recovered from the group traveling with them. On November 17th, just 6 days after Samantha vanished, Basham attempted to carjack a woman and her teenage daughter in a mall parking lot in Ashland, Kentucky. He was arrested at the scene. Folks was taken into custody shortly after. Their multi-state run was over. The federal case against them was built across 2 separate prosecutions. Folks pleaded guilty to all charges in May 2004. Basham went to trial in September 2004 and was found guilty on all counts. Both men were convicted of carjacking, resulting in death, and kidnapping, resulting in death in connection with Samantha Burns, as well as the separate murder of Alice Donovan, a 44-year-old woman from Gallivant's Ferry, South Carolina, who had been abducted from a Walmart parking lot in Conway in the days following Samantha's death. Both men were sentenced to death. In July 2005, and both formally pleaded guilty to the federal carjacking charge in connection with Samantha's killing. And in 2009, Folks wrote to the Associated Press from federal death row, expressing a desire to help investigators find Samantha's remains. He said he wished he had stayed in jail. He said both Samantha Burns and Alice Donovan would be alive if he had. In March 2013, under a sealed federal court order, Folks was temporarily released from the maximum security federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, and escorted by FBI agents to West Virginia. A death row inmate physically removed from custody and brought back to the scene of his crimes in an attempt to locate Samantha's body. The search was conducted near rail tracks in a rural intersection. It found nothing. Samantha's remains have never been recovered. In the years that followed, multiple searches were launched based on tips, including a 2017 excavation in Lawrence County, Ohio, prompted by social media posts claiming her body was buried on a private property. The FBI, local sheriffs, and the Huntington Police Department all participated. They found nothing. Then, on December 23, 2024, President Joe Biden commuted the death sentences of 37 federal death row inmates, including both Chadrick Folks and Brandon Basham. They will now spend the rest of their lives in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Burns' mother declined to comment on camera. A community member near Huntington told local reporters it was not the right decision. No statement came from Folks or Basham. Samantha Burns went to the mall on a Tuesday night to buy clothes for a child she cared about. She called her mother on the way home. She never arrived. Her car burned at the edge of a cemetery while the men who took her continued driving south. More than 22 years later, her family still does not know where she is. The ring is gone, the candy boxes are gone, and the two men who know what happened to her will die in federal custody without ever standing before a West Virginia jury. Some cases end in a courtroom. Some end in a field that investigators searched and searched. It began in May 1984 when two boys playing in a field in Hillsborough County stumbled across the body of a young woman. Her name was Lana Long. She was 19 years old, an exotic dancer at a local club on Nebraska Avenue. She was nude, bound, and her legs had been positioned and spread 5 feet apart. 2 weeks later, another woman was found, then another, then another. And for 8 straight months, investigators in 3 separate Florida counties worked what would become one of the most terrifying serial killing investigations in American history. While a man born and raised in a small West Virginia town continued driving the streets of Tampa, hunting. Robert Joseph Long, known to nearly everyone as Bobby Joe, was born on October 14, 1953, in Canova, West Virginia, a small community sitting on the border where West Virginia meets Kentucky and Ohio. His parents separated when he was young, and he spent most of his childhood with his mother Luella, eventually relocating with her to Miami, Florida. From the beginning, Long's life was marked by difficulties that compounded over time. He was born with an extra X chromosome, a rare genetic condition that caused him to develop breast tissue during puberty. He was teased relentlessly by classmates. He suffered multiple serious head injuries as a child, injuries that doctors would later point to in discussions about the neurological factors behind violent behavior. By his own account, and by those of people who knew him, Long grew up angry, isolated, and increasingly hostile toward women. He married his high school sweetheart at the age of 20, and the couple had 2 children together before their marriage collapsed in divorce in 1980. In the early 1980s, Long arrived in the Tampa Bay area of Florida and began what investigators would later describe as a methodical, escalating pattern of predatory behavior. He started placing classified ads in local newspapers, fake job listings, false promises of employment, to lure women into contact. Over a period of roughly 3 years, authorities believe Long committed approximately 50 rapes using this method, earning him the moniker that would follow him through the courts and into history, the classified ad rapist. He was arrested for assault during this period and placed on probation. He kept going. Then, in March 1984, the crimes escalated beyond anything that had come before. Long's first known murder victim was artist Ann Wick, and a 20-year-old woman who had hitchhiked to Tampa from Indiana and was engaged to be married. Long abducted, assaulted, and strangled her on March 27, 1984. Her body was not discovered until November of that year. Before it was found, 9 more women would be dead. Lana Long's body was discovered on May 13th. Michelle Denise Sims, 22, and a former beauty contestant, was found off a highway overpass on May 27th, her throat slit. Elizabeth Loudenbach, 22, and a factory worker who had simply been walking near her home, was found in an orange grove on June 24th. She had never been involved in the areas Long typically prowled. She was simply in the wrong place. By autumn, the pace had quickened. Vicki Elliott, Kimberly Hops, Chanel Williams, Karen Dinsfriend, their bodies were found across Hillsborough, Pasco, Ace and Pinellas counties between September and October. Then Virginia Johnson, 18. Then Kimberly Swan, 21. At every scene, investigators collected the same signature evidence: rope ligatures, distinctive knot patterns, and most critically, tiny red trilobal nylon carpet fibers. The fibers were unusual enough to link the cases together definitively, but not specific enough yet to identify a suspect. Tire tracks from an uncommon tire model were recovered at multiple locations. The task force working the case, drawing from the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, the FBI, the Tampa Police Department, and Florida law enforcement, knew they were looking for one man. They just couldn't find him. Retired lead investigator Colonel Gary Terry later recalled the weight of it. Every evening when he went home, and he knew that if they didn't catch this man soon, someone else was going to die. Then, in the early hours of November 3rd, 1984, 17-year-old Lisa McVeigh finished a double shift at a Krispy Kreme donut shop and got on her bicycle to ride home. Long abducted her from the road, blindfolded her, and held her captive at his apartment for 26 hours, during which he repeatedly assaulted her. But Lisa McVeigh did something in those 26 hours that changed everything. Blindfolded and terrified, she began memorizing. She paid attention to every turn the car made. She touched surfaces deliberately, leaving her fingerprints everywhere she could reach inside his apartment. She listened to the sounds around her, the ATM machine she heard him use, the layout of the streets, the feel of the surroundings. And when Long, inexplicably, released her instead of killing her, she walked directly to the nearest police station and started talking. Her description was precise. Her recall was extraordinary. Investigators cross-referenced local owners of a 1978 Dodge Magnum, the type of vehicle she had described, with records of anyone who had used an ATM in North Tampa at 3 in the morning on November 4th. One name appeared on both lists. Bobby Joe Long was arrested outside a movie theater on November 16, 1984. When detectives placed photographs of the murder victims on the table in front of him during interrogation, Long looked at them and said, "The complexion of things sure have changed since you came back into the room." He then asked for an attorney, but the forensic case was already overwhelming. That red carpet fibers from his home matched those found at multiple crime scenes. DNA analysis, still emerging as a forensic tool in 1984, added further corroboration. In September 1985, Long pleaded guilty to 8 of the Hillsborough County murders, receiving 33 life sentences. The state retained the right to pursue the death penalty for the murder of Michelle Sims. And in July 1986, after a penalty phase trial, Long was sentenced to death by electrocution. Years of appeals followed. Appeals on evidentiary grounds, constitutional arguments, procedural challenges. Long spent more than 3 decades on Florida's death row. On April 23, 2019, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Long's death warrant, the first he signed after taking office. Final appeals were denied at every level, and including a last-minute petition to the United States Supreme Court on the evening of the execution. At 6:55 p.m. on May 23, 2019, Bobby Joe Long was pronounced dead by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Rayford. He made no final statement. In the front row of the witness gallery sat Lisa McVeigh, now Master Deputy Lisa McVeigh, Noland of the same Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office that had helped catch her attacker 35 years earlier. She had become a law enforcement officer. She had spent her career working to protect the people of the county where she had once been left for dead. She watched the execution in silence. She had said before it happened that she was hoping finally to get a full night's sleep without interruptions. She said she had not slept properly since 1984. And while Bobby Joe Long operated in plain sight on the roads of Tampa Bay for 8 terrifying months, the next case on our list involves a man who carried out his violence not over months or years, but in a single calculated afternoon. 4 targets, 4 locations, and a plan he had made long before he ever pulled the trigger. Number 7, Luke Baber. There is a rule in law enforcement so fundamental, it rarely gets spoken aloud. Once the handcuffs are on, the danger is supposed to be over. On the evening of August 28, 2012, 2 West Virginia State Police troopers believed that rule was holding. They had made their stop. They had made their arrest. The suspect was searched, handcuffed, and seated in the back of their cruiser. A tow truck had been called. In a few minutes, the vehicle would be taken. The paperwork would begin. And what had started as a reckless driving call on Interstate 79 would become nothing more than a routine entry in the night's log. Neither Corporal Marshal Lee Bailey nor Trooper Eric Michael Workman had any reason to believe the call was anything other than what it appeared to be. They were wrong, and they were out of time before they knew it. Marshall Bailey had been with the West Virginia State Police for 17 years. He was, by every account, a seasoned, experienced officer, the kind of trooper who had handled hundreds of stops and earned a reputation for sound judgment in the field. Eric Workman was 26 years old, a Clay County native who had joined the force just the previous year. Before entering law enforcement, he had been a standout baseball player at West Virginia State University. He's an avid outdoorsman with deep roots in the community where he now served. His superiors described him as an outstanding young man with a promising future. The two men worked out of the Clay County detachment, and on the evening of August 28th, they were partners on patrol along the Moore 79 corridor near the Clay-Roane County line. At approximately 7:25 p.m. that evening, a call came in from Nicholas County dispatchers. A white Chevrolet Silverado had been reported traveling northbound on the 79 in an erratic and dangerous manner, weaving, speeding, drawing the attention of other drivers who had called it in. The truck had reportedly wrecked in the median at some point, then restarted and continued southbound. Bailey and Workman responded. At 7:36 p.m., they located the vehicle and pulled it over at the Wallback Park and Ride, an arrest area just off the Wallback exit. The driver was 22-year-old Luke Silas Baber of Oak Hill in Fayette County, West Virginia. The troopers conducted a search of Baber and determined he was under the influence of intoxicants. They placed him under arrest. They handcuffed him, with his hands in front of him, a position allowed under departmental procedure when a suspect is cooperative and the officer determines the situation is under control. Bailey, with 17 years of experience behind him, assessed the scene and made his call. Baber appeared to be complying. The bigger visible concern at that moment was the vehicle itself, which investigators would later determine had been stolen earlier that day. A call went out to King's Wrecker Service for a tow. Baber was placed in the rear seat of the cruiser. The troopers took their positions in the front. What neither of them could have known was what Luke Baber had concealed inside his clothing, hidden in the groin area of his pants, carefully positioned to avoid detection during the pat-down search, was a high .9mm pistol. At some point, while the troopers waited for the tow truck to arrive, Baber retrieved the weapon. Seated in the rear of the cruiser with his hands cuffed in front of him, he raised the gun and fired. Corporal Marshall Bailey was shot and killed at the scene. Trooper Eric Workman was struck and critically wounded. Workman was rushed to Charleston Area Medical Center, where he was placed on life support. He never regained consciousness. He was taken off life support on September 2nd, 2012, 5 days after the shooting. He was 26 years old. When tow truck driver William Massey arrived at the Wallback Park and Ride, he found both troopers down. Baber had already slipped out of the handcuffs, taken Corporal Bailey's service weapon, and fled on foot into the surrounding terrain. Massey was shot in the arm as Baber fled. He managed to get back to his truck and call for help. Within minutes, law enforcement from across multiple agencies, Clay County, Roane County, the state police, and others, converged on the park and ride and fanned out into the area surrounding it. Baber was located approximately 200 yards from where he had been initially arrested, near a barn in a wooded area. A confrontation ensued. Roane County Sheriff's Deputy John Westfall was struck 3 times, in the wrist, the left arm, and the abdomen, before Baber was shot multiple times by the responding officers. Luke Baber was pronounced dead at the scene. Deputy Westfall's bulletproof vest is credited by investigators with saving his life. It was the first fatal shooting of an on-duty West Virginia State Police trooper in 19 years. The last had occurred in April 1993. In the days and weeks that followed, the incident prompted an immediate review by the West Virginia State Police of its arrest procedures, handcuffing policies, and cruiser equipment. At the time of the shooting, state police cruisers were not equipped with a partition or mesh barrier separating the rear passenger area from the front. That absence, standard in many departments at the time, allowed Baber to fire through the open interior of the vehicle without obstruction. And State Police spokesman Sergeant Michael Bayless confirmed that a comprehensive after-action review was underway and that policy changes would follow. A law was subsequently passed requiring that all West Virginia deputy sheriffs be provided with bulletproof vests, a legacy of what happened to Deputy Westfall that night. Records showed that Baber had a prior criminal history, including a conviction for domestic battery after threatening his parents with a BB gun. But that information was not known to Bailey and Workman at the moment of the stop. They had responded to a reckless driving complaint. They had found a man driving a stolen truck under the influence of intoxicants. They had done everything by the book, the search, the arrest, the handcuffing, and they had still been killed. Today, a memorial stands off the Wallback exit along Interstate 79. The interchange at exit 34, the bridges at the site, and a stretch of Route 36 have all been formally dedicated to Corporal Marshal Lee Bailey and Trooper Eric Michael Workman. Every August 28th, the West Virginia State Police marks the anniversary. Bailey's brother Justin spoke at the first memorial ceremony a year after the shooting. Through tears, he said simply, "There is not a day that goes by that he does not think about Marshall." He added that it was a shame it takes a tragedy like this to remind people what law enforcement officers face every single time they step out of the cruiser. Two good men did everything right. They were killed anyway. That is the devastating and irreducible truth at the center of this case. And it is why, more than a decade later, the names Bailey and Workman are still spoken with weight in West Virginia law enforcement communities. And while that evening ended in an instant of violence that no one saw coming, the next case on our list involves a man whose violence was anything but sudden, planned, deliberate, and spread across 4 separate targets on a single afternoon in Monongalia County. Number 8, Jody Lee Hunt. He posted the warning on Facebook before he ever pulled the trigger. The words were there for anyone to read, sitting publicly on his page in the early hours of December 1st, 2014, while the people he was about to target were still asleep. "I'm deeply hurt by the events that lead up to this day," Jody Lee Hunt wrote. "I did not choose to have the love of my life go behind my back and sleep with several guys. My actions were not right, nor were the actions of those who tried to tear me down and take from me. This was not a plan, but a struggle to see that those who strive to hurt me receive their fair pay of hurt, like I received. Nobody who saw it called police. By the time the day was over, 4 people were dead across 3 separate crime scenes in Monongalia County, West Virginia. And Jody Lee Hunt was gone too, found in a truck in the woods with a self-inflicted gunshot wound, the same pistol he had used all day still nearby. Jody Lee Hunt, 39, of Westover, was the owner and operator of J&J Towing and Repair, a small towing company he ran in the Morgantown area. On paper, he was a businessman, a man who showed up when your car broke down, who navigated dispatch rotations and county contracts and the ordinary, unglamorous machinery of the towing industry. But the history that followed him told a different story. Court records from Virginia showed that in January 1999, Hunt had abducted a former girlfriend in Winchester, triggering a 7-hour standoff at a local manufacturing plant before he surrendered. He pleaded guilty to felony kidnapping and use of a firearm in the commission of a felony and served time in prison. In 2001, back in West Virginia, he was convicted of wanton endangerment with a firearm and sentenced to 5 years at Huttonsville Correctional Center. He was, by law, prohibited from possessing a firearm. He had one anyway, and investigators later confirmed he had obtained it through an individual rather than a licensed dealer. A former co-worker who had known Hunt after his release from prison described him to a West Virginia radio program as a man who always seemed to believe people owed him something. "He just seemed like the type of guy that expected something," the man said. "That people owed him something. That's the impression I always got." Hunt bragged openly about the 1999 abduction, according to this same account. He spoke about it casually, as if it demonstrated something about his willingness to go further than other people would. In the 2 years leading up to December 2014, Hunt had been in a relationship with 39-year-old Sharon K. Berkshire of Westover. It was a volatile relationship by the accounts of those close to it. Berkshire had filed a domestic violence petition against Hunt in late 2013. She dropped it weeks later when things appeared to improve between them. She filed again in late 2014. She dropped that one too. Court records confirmed that at the time of the killings, no active protective order was in place. The relationship had ended. Berkshire had moved on. She was now living with 28-year-old Michael David Frum in a home near the Cheat Lake area, and the two had been together for several months. At some point, according to investigators, Frum sent Hunt a taunting text message directly informing him that he was now with Berkshire. Hunt posted about the message on his Facebook page. "Having a man text you to say I'm with her and you are stuck without her is not a game," he wrote. "Games hurt people's hearts. Meanwhile, a separate source of fury had been building on the professional side of Hunt's life. For months, he had been lodging formal complaints with Monongalia County commissioners, alleging that his competitors, particularly Doug Brady, owner of Doug's Towing, whose business sat less than a quarter mile from Hunt's own, had been poaching towing jobs by responding to dispatch calls out of rotation. Brady's wife Kathy told reporters that she and her husband had years earlier rejected Hunt's offer to buy their business. "He's always been jealous of Doug," she said. "I just never dreamed he hated Doug that much." In the days before December 1st, those around Hunt noticed a change. His stepson Tristan Bird recalled that about a week earlier, Hunt had come to tow Bird's broken-down car at a drive-thru and had seemed agitated, tense, restless, not himself. All Bird said Hunt told him directly, "I'm not afraid to go back to prison." Bird said even then, he didn't think Hunt was capable of what was coming. On the morning of December 1st, 2014, Jody Lee Hunt began moving. According to the sequence investigators reconstructed, Hunt first drove to the home on Sunset Beach Road in the Cheat Lake area where Sharon Berkshire was living with Michael Froome. Both were there. Froome was shot and killed inside the home. Berkshire was shot twice and found outside. Investigators believe she may have been attempting to escape when she was struck. She died at the scene. Hunt then drove across Westover to Doug's Towing. He found Doug Brady, 45, working alone in his garage. He shot Brady in the head twice. Brady died where he fell. Hunt's fourth victim was his own cousin, 43-year-old Jody Taylor, who had also reportedly been romantically involved with Berkshire at some point. Taylor was shot and killed at his home. 4 people, 3 locations. A 12-hour manhunt that placed every school in Monongalia County on lockdown. Police released a photograph of Hunt's black Ford F-150 extended cab pickup, the same truck that Berkshire had posted a photo of on her Facebook page just weeks earlier with the caption, "New ride for this girl." The county was on edge. Parents lined up outside elementary schools to wait for their children. Hunt had vanished into the roads of Monongalia County, and nobody knew where he was going next. Then, at some point during the manhunt, Hunt called 911 himself. According to a recording released by WV Metro News, Hunt told the dispatcher in a flat, matter-of-fact tone, "It's not fair for them to lose their life if I don't lose my life, sir. That's the way it goes." He was asked if his actions were justified. "None of it's justified, and none of it's right," he said. Approximately 90 minutes after that call, law enforcement located Hunt's black F-150, parked in a wooded area in the southern part of Monongalia County near Everettville. Hunt was inside. He had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The pistol, illegally obtained, illegally possessed, was found with him. There was no trial. There was no courtroom. There was no opportunity for the families of Doug Brady, Michael Froome, Sharon Berkshire, or Jody Taylor to face the man who had taken their loved ones and demand an answer. The Facebook post, the 911 call, and the body in the woods were all that remained. And domestic violence advocates in West Virginia pointed to the Berkshire case in the weeks that followed, noting that she had sought protection twice and walked away from it twice, as many victims do, and that the warning signs had been present and visible long before December 1st. That conversation about the patterns that precede intimate partner violence was one of the few things that outlasted the manhunt. And while Jody Lee Hunt's rampage unfolded across an entire day of calculated movement, the next case on our list belongs to a man who chose a completely different method. Not guns, not confrontation, but a tape recorder, a sealed envelope, and the quiet decision to confess everything before anyone had asked. Number 9, James Childers. The package arrived at the Clarksburg Police Department on the morning of June 1st, 2009, and nobody had sent for it. Nobody had been expecting it. It came through the regular mail, addressed to Lieutenant Robert Matheny of the Clarksburg Police, and inside it were several handwritten letters and a single audio cassette tape. 2 hours of recording in the voice of a man named James E. Childers, confessing to 5 murders and 4 separate acts of arson committed across Harrison, Barber, and Braxton counties in West Virginia. Childers had not been arrested. He had not been caught. He had not been backed into a corner or confronted with irrefutable evidence. He had simply decided, on his own terms and in his own time, to sit down and record everything, and then mail it to the police. James Earl Childers was born on February 8, 1964, and grew up on a 96-acre family farm in Copen, a small rural community in Braxton County. He was one of several children raised on the land his family had worked for generations. At some point in his late teens or early 20s, he left Copen and relocated to Clarksburg, a city of roughly 16,000 people in Harrison County, where he spent the following decades working odd jobs in construction and eventually settling into a role as a general handyman. He was known around Clarksburg. Officers who walked the same streets he did recognized him on sight. Neighbors described him as friendly, helpful, and quick to offer assistance with household repairs or yard work. He had no criminal record prior to the crimes he later confessed to. Even police who knew him in passing never suspected a thing. In the late 1990s, records indicate that Childers began struggling, and signs of depression emerged. He developed problems with alcohol and substance use and sought treatment at various points. But outwardly, to the people who saw him every day walking the streets of this small West Virginia city, he remained the same familiar, unremarkable handyman. Whatever was happening inside him stayed invisible for years. Then came the fires. Between approximately 2005 and 2009, a series of arsons occurred in and around Clarksburg. 2 separate fires were set on Northcott Street. Others followed in different parts of the area. Investigators were working the cases but had no clear suspect. What nobody in law enforcement knew at the time, what nobody could have known, was that the same man who waved at officers from the sidewalk and helped elderly neighbors carry their groceries was setting those fires and committing murders. The first victim investigators would later identify was 26-year-old Carrie Lynn Baker of Clarksburg. She had been reported missing in the summer of 2008 and had not been found. The second was Carolyn Sue Sauerbein, 40 years old, from Philippi, a woman who had known Childers since 2001 and had, by some accounts, been romantically involved with him at some point. 3 other victims were named on the tape. Their identities and their remains have never been fully confirmed. On the 2-hour recording that arrived in Lieutenant Matheny's hands on June 1, 2009, Childers spoke at length. The tape was described by investigators as largely incoherent in its structure, rambling, disorganized, full of tangents and digressions. But running through it were specific and verifiable details about crimes that had not yet been publicly connected. Childers described the locations where he had left bodies. He described the arsons. He described with what investigators characterized as an egotistical rather than remorseful tone the reasoning behind his actions, a deep misanthropy, a pervasive resentment and distrust of nearly everyone around him, including members of his own family. He did not express guilt. He did not ask for forgiveness. The FBI, which was later called in to assess the case, described Childers in their behavioral analysis as a man who believed no one could judge him because no one could understand him. Yet the tape contains something else too. Childers boasted that he had been carrying a weapon during previous encounters with law enforcement and had been in a position to harm 3 specific officers, including a Harrison County Sheriff's deputy, and had chosen not to. He framed this as evidence of his superiority. He had been stopped once, he claimed on the recording, while fleeing one of his arson scenes with matches still in his pocket. The officer had let him go. In Childers' telling, this was further proof that he had been operating invisibly among the people who were supposed to catch him. Within hours of receiving the package, officers were dispatched to the locations Childers had described. In Barber County, near Route 57, investigators found the decomposed remains of Carrie Lynn Baker. At the Childers family farm in Braxton County, they found the remains of Carolyn Sue Sauerbein, who had been shot twice in the head. Both identifications were confirmed through forensic analysis. An arrest warrant was issued for James Childers immediately. He was traced to the Townhouse Motel in Clarksburg. On June 2, 2009, one day after his confession arrived in the mail, law enforcement surrounded the motel. When Childers became aware that officers had closed in around him, he did not attempt to run and he did not attempt to negotiate. He picked up a gun and shot himself in the head. He died at the scene. He was 45 years old. What followed was years of searches and unanswered questions. Investigators returned to the family farm in Braxton County multiple times, using cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar, as searching for the 3 additional victims Childers had described on the tape. The farm covered 96 acres of rugged West Virginia terrain, Searches continued through late 2009 and resumed in 2010 before being suspended. Not because investigators believed there was nothing there, but because they ran out of evidence sufficient to justify continued access to the private property. In 2017, a West Virginia film production company called Lost Valley Studios produced a documentary titled Mountain of the Missing, interviewing former classmates, neighbors, and law enforcement figures connected to the case and attempting to arrange new searches of the farm. The Childers family declined to grant access. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit formally classified James Childers as a serial killer, a classification based not just on the number of victims, but on the pattern of the crimes, the varied motives, the geographic spread, and the nature of the communication. He had killed both men and women. He had used different methods. He had committed ancillary crimes alongside the murders. And he had taunted police in a written document that was, in effect, a manifesto. As of today, 3 of the 5 victims' Childers confessed to remain unaccounted for. Their names are unknown. Their families, if they exist and if they have been searching, have no resolution. The farm in Braxton County still sits on those 96 acres, and what may be buried on it has never been confirmed. James Childers constructed his confession with enough detail to be believed, but not enough to allow full closure. And whether that was intentional, no one left alive can say. And while James Childers chose to confess everything while hiding from everyone, the final case on our list belongs to a man who did the opposite. A man whose crimes unfolded not in secrecy, but across decades of hunting and escalation, out in the open roads of a state that had no idea what had been born there. Number 10. William Wickline. The skill that made him dangerous was one he learned in prison. While serving time on unrelated charges during the 1970s, William Dean Wickline Jr. was assigned to work in the facility's slaughterhouse. He learned how to break down an animal carcass with precision, how to make clean cuts, how to work efficiently, and how to separate what needed to be separated. Investigators who later examined his crimes agreed on one thing. Whatever else could be said about Wickline, he had learned those lessons well. When he eventually applied that knowledge to human beings, the results were so precise and so deliberate that one former West Virginia prosecutor described him simply as a very bad man. That summary, understated as it is, does not begin to capture what William Wickline left behind. William Dean Wickline Jr. was born on March 15, 1952, in Reynoldsburg, Ohio. His early life appeared unremarkable on its surface. A stable enough household, a father, a mother, and the ordinary landscape of an Ohio upbringing. By his own account, and by school records, he was initially a decent student with some athletic ability. Wrestling was his outlet. But the trajectory shifted in his teenage years, and it shifted hard. Wickline fell into juvenile delinquency early, minor offenses at first, then escalating. And by the time he reached adulthood, he had accumulated arrest records across multiple states for burglary, drug dealing, and crimes associated with the violent underworld of the drug trade. He moved between Ohio and West Virginia repeatedly, operating in the shadow economy of narcotics trafficking and collecting enemies the way that world tends to produce them, steadily and without apology. A woman who knew Wickline across multiple periods of his adult life told investigators something that stayed with them. Each time he was released from custody, she said, he had changed. Each time, she told authorities, he got more serious. That observation, in retrospect, was precisely accurate. By the late 1970s, Wickline had spent enough time in and out of correctional facilities that the prison environment had become, by all accounts, his natural habitat. He understood its hierarchies, operated within them, and by some reports actively cultivated a reputation for violence that gave him standing inside. When he was released in 1979, investigators believe he was already operating as more than just a drug trafficker. He was functioning as someone willing to use lethal force for pay. On November 20th, 1979, a woman arrived at a residence on Dry Run Road in Parkersburg, West Virginia, and made a discovery that would haunt the region for decades. Her name was not publicly released. The man she found was Charles Morgan Marsh, yet 34 years old, a construction worker from South Carolina who was also a known drug dealer. Marsh was on his bed. His hands were handcuffed behind his back. He had been strangled with a telephone cord. and his head had been removed from his body with what the coroner's examination described as 1 or 2 precise, skilled cuts. The kind of cuts that indicated the person who made them knew exactly what they were doing. Marsh's severed head had been placed on the nightstand beside the bed. The killer had taken the time, after removing it, to comb Marsh's hair. On the wall nearby, a message had been scrawled. "I came, you weren't home, I love you." The initial investigation was handled by the Wood County Sheriff's Office and the West Virginia State Police. Investigators worked the case for years. Every lead went cold. The nature of the crime, a drug dealer, handcuffed, tortured, and precisely decapitated, pointed strongly toward a contract killing, possibly tied to territory disputes or money owed. But without a suspect, the case sat open and unsolved. It would be years, and it would come from an entirely different investigation before the truth began to surface. In 1982, in Columbus, Ohio, Christopher and Peggy Lurch were dead. 28-year-old Christopher and 24-year-old Peggy had been involved in the drug scene operating around Columbus. And on August 14, 1982, they crossed paths with William Wickline over a debt of $6,000 in cocaine money. Wickline brought his girlfriend, Teresa Kemp, with him to their residence. He told the Lurches he was there to help Christopher with a plumbing problem, a clogged drain. And once he was inside, he slashed Christopher Lurch's throat over the bathtub. Then, while Kemp held Peggy's legs, Wickline strangled her. Both bodies were then methodically dismembered. Wickline used the skills he had developed in the prison slaughterhouse to break down the remains. The pieces were bagged and distributed across multiple trash receptacles in the Columbus area. The bodies of Christopher and Peggy Lurch have never been found, not a single fragment of either of them, as of today. A missing persons report was filed on the couple in late August 1982. The case sat unsolved. Wickline continued operating. Investigators later received information from informants suggesting that, in early 1983, unidentified human remains found floating in a Miami at Florida Canal were connected to Wickline, a suspected contract killing carried out during a brief period when he was operating in the Southeast. Those suspicions were never confirmed, and Wickline was never charged in Florida. The breakthrough in both the Ohio and West Virginia cases came in 1984, while Wickline was serving a jail sentence on unrelated burglary charges. Columbus investigators, working a drug trafficking case involving 2 women connected to Wickline, offered immunity in exchange for information. The testimony that came back implicated Wickline in the Lurch murders in specific, credible detail. Teresa Kemp, his former girlfriend, told investigators what had happened on August 14, 1982. She described the planning, the deception used to gain entry to the Lurch home, the killings, and the disposal of the remains. How she had kept, in a safety deposit box, handcuffs and jewelry belonging to the Lurches, items that were recovered and confirmed as belonging to the victims. Word of Wickline's involvement in dismemberment killings reached West Virginia authorities. When Columbus investigators contacted Wood County and asked whether there was an unsolved decapitation murder in the area, the answer was immediate: yes. In 1985, Wickline was indicted in Wood County, West Virginia, for the murder of Charles Marsh, but the West Virginia case would never reach trial. The decision was made to prosecute the Ohio case first, given the strength of the evidence and the testimony of Teresa Kemp. Trial began in Ohio on July 30, 1985. Wickline waived a jury and was tried by a 3-judge panel. The prosecution built its case around Kemp's testimony. All the recovered evidence from the safety deposit box and the circumstantial trail connecting Wickline to both victims. Wickline maintained throughout that Kemp had invented the story, that she was a spurned lover, fabricating testimony to gain custody of her infant son and avoid prosecution for her own drug use. The 3 judges did not believe him. On August 7, 1985, they returned guilty verdicts on 2 counts of aggravated murder. On September 20, 1985, Wickline was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Christopher Lurch and to death for the murder of Peggy Lurch, her killing classified as having been committed to eliminate a witness to the prior crime. He showed no emotion when the sentences were read. For 19 years, Wickline appealed his convictions through both Ohio state courts and the federal system. Yet every appeal was denied. The West Virginia indictment for the Marsh murder remained technically active, but was never prosecuted. With Wickline already facing a death sentence in Ohio, it was considered an unnecessary expenditure of legal resources. The charges were eventually dropped and the case formally closed. On February 24, 2004, a clemency hearing was held in Ohio. The board concluded that Wickline had shown no remorse across nearly 2 decades of incarceration and had never accepted responsibility for what he had done. The application for clemency was denied. Ohio Governor Bob Taft declined to intervene. On March 30, 2004, William Dean Wickline Jr. was executed by lethal injection at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. He was pronounced dead at 10:11 in the morning. He was 52 years old. He was the 11th inmate to be executed in Ohio since the state resumed capital punishment in 1999. He made no final statement of consequence. The bodies of Christopher and Peggy Lurch have never been recovered. The Marsh murder in Parkersburg is still listed as solved by indictment, though no trial was ever held. Wickline's confirmed victim count stands at 3, with investigators across 2 states long believing the true number was higher. The slaughterhouse skills that made his crimes so precise and so difficult to prosecute, no bodies, no forensic evidence, no remains to examine, were, in the end, the same skills that kept the full scope of what he did permanently out of reach. A man who learned to be dangerous in prison, who came back out more serious every time, and who left almost nothing behind. That is the legacy of William Wickline, and it is, in its way, the most unsettling kind of criminal legacy there is. The one where we know the worst happened, but cannot prove the half of it.